Today we have Ambassador retired John Blaney in the studio with us to talk about the Liberian Civil War. He was the U.S. Ambassador to Liberia from 2002 to 2005, and he played a significant role in ending the conflict there. He played a key role in many post-war stabilization efforts, including the disarmament of approximately 100,000 combatants from 3 armies and the democratic transition of Liberia. He was awarded the President's Distinguished Service Award and the Secretary of State's Distinguished Honor Award, which is the highest decoration in the State Department. So let's begin by talking about the nature of the conflict in Liberia, and if you could describe what the drivers of the conflict were.
In Liberia, the roots of the conflict go back very far. As you may know, Liberia was founded by the United States in a very real sense. There were slaves that were sent back from in the 19th century to Liberia by the abolitionists of America, as well as some from Britain. And they ended up in what is now known as Liberia. Unfortunately, they were not people who were from the same part of Africa. So there was an immediate ethnic tension between the former slaves that were sent back to Africa and those people who already lived in that area. Right. Now that tension persisted for a long time because the Americo-Liberians, the small percentage of people who called themselves descendants of those who had come from America and Britain, ruled that country very much as an antebellum South society. In other words, they put themselves at the apex of things, and they rather ruthlessly ruled the indigenous people. They did not enslave them, but they made them very much second-class citizens for 150 years about. That situation ended in 1980 when Sergeant Sammy Doe led a revolt and actually executed the sitting president Tolbert of Liberia and made himself president of Liberia. His rule lasted about 10 years, and it was a disaster. It was corrupt, and it was very ham-handed and harsh, and it spawned many rebellions against him. And he was executed in 1990, and one of the warring parties, one of the rebel groups that went against Sammy Doe was led by a fellow named Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor was the individual that I had to deal with in 2002. And again, the regime of Charles Taylor was a very corrupt, very patrimonial, very human rights violating regime. And so again, rebels started to invade to try to overthrow Taylor in about the year 2000. So by 2002, there was a full-blown civil war underway to oust Taylor.
Describe what role the neighboring states had in the conflict, if any.
The neighboring states suffered from the conflict. Charles Taylor projected power into the sub-region of West Africa. This is the real blood diamond story. Taylor was after diamonds and other forms of wealth, and he actually subsidized and helped organize the RUF in Sierra Leone, the rebel movement, the ones that chopped off the hands of people by the thousands and terrorized people. His fighters also went into Guinea and to Ivory Coast, now known as Cote d'Ivoire. There was tremendous resentment about Taylor's predatory activities in the sub-region of West Africa, and that made it a very personal vendetta against Taylor when the rebels moved in to try to take over.
Did any of the neighboring states support any of the rebel forces inside of Liberia?
Yes, absolutely. And the reason was that Charles Taylor had performed predatory operations outside the borders of Liberia. In fact, Charles Taylor is in prison today, not for what he did in Liberia, but rather for the support that he gave to the rebels in Sierra Leone. These are called the RUF. These are the people that had cut the arms off tens of thousands of people. And of course, this is the motivation behind it in part was that this is the real blood diamond story. Taylor was after the diamonds in Sierra Leone and elsewhere, and his backing of these rebel movements and his own use of fighters in other countries in the region sparked a rebellion not only from the interior of a large group of Muslims moving mostly from Guinea towards the coast, from east from west to east, but also a second rebel army composed of the Kron called the Movement for Democracy in Liberia, or MODEL. The first rebel army, I should have said, was Liberia Liberians for Reconciliation and Democracy, or the LIRD. So there were two rebel armies faced off against Taylor's people who were in Monrovia, and Taylor had the army of Liberia, but more importantly, he had a whole range of militias that outnumbered the actual army of Liberia, and those were the three sides in the conflict.
Okay. And so the state of Guinea supported some rebel groups. The state of Sierra Leone supported some rebel groups that were fighting Taylor and his forces inside Liberia.
Certainly the state of Guinea was active in that regard. It's less clear, you see, because there was peace building in Sierra Leone earlier. So the state of Sierra Leone, with the help of external forces, such as the British in particular, was more or less stabilized and did not play that type of support role for rebel groups that Guinea did. But many Sierra Leoneans and Liberians and Guineans living abroad helped to fund the rebel movements, be it LIRD or MODEL.
So there's three armies that are kind of coming together at the capital.
Right, and in fact, Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, was besieged, and all the water was cut off, the food was cut off. This is for a long period of time. I was inside of it, holed up in the embassy. All the other embassies had left, had closed their doors and left. We were alone. Then, when it got really bad in mid-2003, there began to be a bombardment of the city randomly of heavy mortars, machine gun fire, and other things strafed the embassy and strafed a lot of the other buildings. There were many, many people who were injured or killed.
Why did the U.S. keep its embassy open in Monrovia?
That's an excellent question, and a disputed one. There was no clear view in Washington that ought to be done. In fact, the Pentagon was adamant that we close the embassy and leave. I don't mean draw down, Jim. I mean absolutely close the embassy and leave. Colin Powell, and that view was voiced by Donald Rumsfeld. Colin Powell, on the other hand, supported my wanting to stay and see if we could find some way to end the war and stabilize the situation, because my fear was that what would happen is that the armies would essentially move downtown and into the capital city. There would be a Rwanda-esque type of bloodbath. Thousands and thousands would die, and the end product would also draw in the neophyte peacekeepers who were not from the UN initially. They were from West African countries, from the body known as ECOWAS, the West African states. There are very, very few of them. So they expected to become a fourth combatant party in the conflict, as they had done in an earlier intervention years ago. That the commander told me he expected to become a combatant party. And that would have gone on indefinitely, and I think the outcome would have been a kind of a Somalia West, a kind of failed state, but much better endowed than Somalia. There would have been a great nurturing ground, germination center for terrorism worldwide in Western Africa today. That's why I didn't leave, as well as, of course, the fact that I was very worried about that many people being killed.
So what did we do, and what U.S. assets and resources did you use to do them?
Did I use to? Well, we didn't have many, essentially, to begin with, because there was this dispute in Washington about whether I should be there at all. The assets most important that I had was my wonderful staff, including my 7-person Marine security guard, which were stellar in their performance of protecting the embassy against all odds. We were under fire for weeks. It was not directed at us, but you're still dead if you're hit by a random mortar shot. So we stayed despite the bombardment, despite the dwindling of supplies and all the rest of it, and disease. There was a lot of disease that occurred during the siege of Monrovia because of what I had said earlier about the consequences of leaving. And gradually, as we stubbornly made our stand, it sort of rallied people back in Washington. And eventually we were sent reinforcements just for the embassy called a FAST. A FAST is a defensive military unit of the Marine Corps that augments security of embassies in difficult situations. So that was a great help.
Right.
And then another thing that happened that was very helpful was eventually, after really weeks and weeks of going through the siege, a MU, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, was sent down the coast of Africa towards Liberia, but with orders not to do anything from Donald Rumsfeld. And so they stayed even out of sight of land. And of course, I was desperate to get them within sight so I could have the leverage of everybody knowing that there was this force there.
Right.
Fortunately, the international press made it clear that they were nearby. So I took a chance. I talked to the Commander General Okonkwo of the ECOWAS force, the small vanguard peacekeeping unit, and he and I took him across no man's land to talk to General Cobra, the commanding general of the largest of the rebel armies, to tell him that it was over, that the war was over. In fact, the reason I'd come back to Liberia was I was working on the formal peace agreement, but we would achieve these ceasefires and work on the components of the peace agreement and what would happen if the war ended, but then the peace agreements would just fall apart all the time. So we couldn't stop the war. That's why I went back to Liberia.
Right.
And so in order to stop the war, I had to go see the person who was pressing the war, and that was General Cobra of the LERD. And so Okonkwo and I, in this tiny little Jeep convoy, went across this open water over the Monserrata River to talk to General Cobra, literally I walked, we went over dead bodies to get to him, to talk to him. And it was a very difficult session. It was clear that that he would like to take Monrovia. That was his goal. And so I went over multiple times, and the last time I went over, the second time I went over with the commander of the MU, that Marine unit that was whose centerpiece was the carrier Iwo Jima, which is a huge ship with thousands of combatants available who are battle hardened. And let's just say I played it up pretty heavily. I arranged with General Turner that even though he had no orders to engage anybody or put any boots on the ground, how about if he just flew one of those Harrier jets over where we're talking, you know, the kind that can go vertically instead of just horizontally. Well, he took a jet and he put it right on top of the building we were negotiating in with General Cobra. And it shook the building like a leaf. I still don't hear right. And and General Cobra's aide whispered something to General Cobra. Of course, I couldn't hear what it was, but 2 years later, he told me that he told him, why don't we do what Ambassador Blaney wants, and because I don't want to die today. So they thought, in other words, they thought I had command of all these thousands of Marines. So we got them to sign a document that essentially made them pull back from Monrovia itself. They were already inside the city, threatening downtown. And then the same document permitted the insertion of an intervening force, that little unit of peacekeepers I put in between the combatant parties, between Taylor's people and the LERD, and then later I did the same thing down south between Modell's people and Taylor's people, and the war essentially ended. And then about a week or so later, the official end of the war document and the comprehensive peace agreement was signed. But the war didn't end by the peace agreement. The war ended on the battlefield, and it ended essentially in a bluff.
No, it's an interesting, fascinating story.
Yeah.
What were international responses to the conflict, and were any of those effective?
You have to remember, Jim, that the conflict was 14 years long, so there were lots of different international sanctions policies
Right.
from the UN Security Council and so forth. But during the time I was there, we needed everybody on deck to try to deal with this complex situation.
Right.
And so we created an international contact group for Liberia. Now note that that contact group wasn't even chaired by the United States. It was chaired by the EC Commission, and it was chaired by the country of Ghana, another African country. And we would deal with these problems every day, whether it was economic, political, what to do about Taylor, how do we get a ceasefire to stick, a million things. And then in the post-war period, the same thing. We had a working body, not just at the higher levels, but also locally, one in Monrovia, until the other embassies left during the most intense fighting. And then it resumed after they came back and joined me. But also we had lots of international action at the UN itself, sanctions policies. We had the specialized body of the United Nations. The World Bank played a very important role in reconstruction. Colin Powell and the World Bank co-chaired a donors meeting in early 2004, right after the war ended, to try to generate resources to rebuild a decimated economy that was totally dead. And most importantly of all, I think, from the international side, we had a UN peacekeeping force, which was the follow-on force to these ECOWAS, this little ECOWAS unit, Vanguard unit. And the Blue Helmets came in, and at some point, years later, they rose up to 15,000, the largest deployment of UN peacekeepers in the world. And they helped ensure that Liberia would not return to war, and they also helped rebuild the country and attend to health issues and everything you can think of, governance and so forth, and did a great job, I think, and they were led ably by General Jock Klein.
You mentioned a number of things that I'd like to touch on.
Sure.
One is disease
Yes.
and health issues from the Civil War.
Yes.
And you said that Monrovia there was health crises occurring in Monrovia too at the time. Can you describe some of those, the impact of the war on the health of the society there?
You see, this was like a 14th century siege during the height of the fighting. There was no food coming in. There was no medicine. All the medical facilities had been destroyed, and there was barely one hospital operating sometimes, sort of. Disease was rampant. Cholera, in particular, there was a huge cholera outbreak in the last months of the war during the siege period. Many died. I went to a chamber of people with 1,000 people with cholera, and most of them died. And there was also, interestingly, just after the war ended, of course, the infrastructure, the health infrastructure, was totally destroyed. And so one of the first things we did after the war ended was to try to do humanitarian relief and health-related actions that would stop cholera and stop all these other diseases. People were starving to death, so there was many people were starving to death. So we had to bring in food. It was a total mess and very urgent. So we worked on that, but in 2004 there was a plague that broke out. We weren't sure what it was. In retrospect, it was probably Ebola. And I turned to General Klein of UNMIL, the UN peacekeepers, and urged him to deal very drastically with this. So essentially, we burnt down the entire village and compensated the people for it, and it was stopped with only a handful of casualties. But that story is not well known. But the later outbreak of Ebola, after I had left Liberia as ambassador, about 8 or 9 years after I had left, was the largest outbreak of Ebola in the history of the world as a pandemic. And one thing that we're proud of is that despite the opposition, frankly, of the Pentagon to have us do SSR, security sector reform in Liberia, I went personally to Senator John Warner, Senator McCain, and to Senator Clinton and asked them for the money I needed to train a new and clean and more honest and professional army and police force, because Charles Taylor's army and police force were predatory. They would go in and raid their own people, sort of an Operation Pay Yourself, and they would rape and loot and steal everything, and that's the way they got paid.
Right.
And so we built from scratch and checked the backgrounds of people, a brand new army and police force. I used a contractor to build the army, and the police force we paid for, and the UN, UNMIL, peacekeepers trained the new police force. Well, when the Ebola plague broke out in 2014 initially, but it got worse 2015 and 16, it was not just in Liberia, by the way, but in much of West Africa. Right. And it wasn't as serious in Liberia as it was in Sierra Leone, and it was stopped largely in Liberia because there was a trained professional security force that allowed heroic actions by Médecins Sans Frontières and other doctors to come in and do the medical work and to keep the people from moving around too much and spreading the pandemic, and to track it down, and all those things that needed to be done. Now, some of those policemen and army people lost their lives because they got infected, but they were highly disciplined. I credit the Liberians for having done a wonderful job stopping it by having a security force so professional, and their leader, Brownie Samukai, who was the one who helped to train those units. So the U.S. part of stemming the plague in 2014-16, I think, really stems from the decision to go ahead and do SSR, and also, of course, we eventually had a command that covered Africa. When I was ambassador, there was no AFRICOM. There was no Pentagon unit to cover Africa. It was handled out of EUCOM, the European Command. And with AFRICOM, they actually deployed during the middle of the Ebola plague into Liberia and built facilities. Now, some would argue that it was a little late in much of what they did, and perhaps it was, but it sure helped also to create a web of capacity and institution building and expertise that could help stem the next Ebola plague or prevent it. And that was wonderful. We also had the CDC, who deployed into Liberia and did a great job. Now, the one international, you ask about the international response, there was only one disappointment, if you will, on the response to the Ebola plague, and that was the WHO, the World Health Organization. Now, the WHO, Jim, is supposed to be the 911 number you call for a pandemic like this. You know, whether it's bird flu in Asia or Ebola or something else. And frankly, they were slow off the blocks. They just didn't get their act together. I will say, however, I think they've learned some lessons from what happened in West Africa in the Ebola plague, and I do think they're a better organization now than they were. So that gives you a flavor for some of the reactions.
So there's a direct relationship between the instability and the conflict and the fighting and the outbreak of diseases and the expansion of those diseases and the ability to control those diseases.
I would say that during the Civil War, I mean, the real heavy Ebola plague was 9 years after the war. But during the war, I would say it certainly upped the death toll amazingly. There were people dying all over the place because of cholera, of starvation, as well as being shot and mortared and whatever. So yes, it did exacerbate the war during the war, but you know, when you have in the aftermath of a war like that a totally decimated society and a total lack of rule of law, and you don't have any institutions or facilities left standing, then it's an open invitation for disease to erupt and grow much more rapidly than under normal circumstances. So, for example, during the Ebola plague of around 2015-16, I was invited to go in and give some advice to those who had been fighting the Ebola plague about Liberia. And one thing I warned AFRICOM, the new Africa Command, about was to start now. Don't wait, but start now to prepare a plan to deal with a pandemic when there's a war ongoing, like Congo. And go back and do a plan so that you know what you're going to do when that happens, because the disease is endemic in a number of African countries. I don't know if they did it, but as you may have read, there's been an outbreak of Ebola in Congo this month.
Right. Okay, let's shift to the economy.
Yeah.
How did the war impact the economy of Liberia, and have they been able to recover today?
The economy of Liberia was decimated by the war. There was nothing left. The economy was dead from any parameter. Exports, none. Imports, none. No electrical grid at all. There was no electricity. There was no real jobs. Everybody was starving. Disease was prevalent and omnipresent. Really, so relief was one of our first things that we did. And the other problem you had, quite frankly, was you had massive corruption that was Taylor's legacy, but also existed before Charles Taylor. We had to essentially restart a dead economy. And one of the priorities that we gave, besides the assistance that we were rendering for relief, was to create jobs. What did I do? Part of that money, when I went to Senators Warner, Clinton, and McCain and others, I told them that I was going to create a kind of a CCC. Now, the CCC was the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s that built all our federal parks. You remember that?
Right.
And from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I, being an old fellow, remember some of the impressive projects they did. So what I did was I hired, because you had tens of thousands of young men and child soldiers involved in this conflict. And they were all running around the streets with loaded automatic weapons. So we did DDR, we did disarmament, and the UN did that. But then what would they do? They could always find other weapons and go back to war. But instead, I hired them. And I created the Blaney brigades. And they went off and they fixed those roads that they just destroyed, and those bridges they'd just blown up. And they fixed those health clinics that they just burned down. And I would send them to various places around the country, partly to disrupt their chains of command to their rebel leaders. So I would send them to places where they didn't even know where they were. And the strange thing, and I'd pay them $2 a day, and you're going to probably think, well, that's not much money, but believe me, it was big money for them. And I sent them up there to do all these worthwhile projects, planting more food, swamp rice, whatever, and they loved it. They absolutely loved it, and it helped cement the peace. And also we did a lot of other things to get the economy going, and so did many other international donors from the donor conference, and also companies. One of the companies that I urged stay was Firestone, because Liberia is the home of Firestone rubber plantation. And so they stayed, and one thing that they did after the war was to expand production of smallholder plots. That is to say, not to expand the plantation itself, but rather give them little plots of land and some starter rubber to begin to be their own small capitalists. Well, this has really taken hold. Because the Ebola plague hit, there was a huge drop in GDP growth, and it did damage the recovery quite dramatically. Trade dropped. You can imagine how tourism fell to almost zero, because nobody wanted to be, a victim of Ebola. So yes, there was a huge hit on the economy, and then it took that 2.5-year, 3-year period for Ebola to be contained, and then for the new cases to fall to zero. Since that time, since 2016, essentially, when the all clear sort of went out, Liberia has gone back to economic growth and is responding again. So economically, yes, it had a very unfortunate, very unlucky, very sad pandemic body blow to the economic recovery. But to their credit, the Liberian people have carried on, and it's now growing again.
You talked about the warring factions and the peace by inserting this force in between, this peacekeeping force in between them, and you got them to sign the peace agreement. But what about governance and the politics of the state, going forward? Could they ever trust each other Are there still ethnic tensions? You know, a new president, Sirleaf was elected, I guess, one of the first women to be elected to the presidency in the country. How did the politics, you know, heal, or if it has even healed?
One of the things that I was always keen to protect during this whole transition, not only to get Charles Taylor out of the equation, but to protect the line of legitimacy. So, for example, when a lot of parties urged Taylor to leave office, it wasn't just the United States, but of course George Bush even said he should leave. But there were others, African leaders, myself, others who urged him to leave office, leave Liberia, so the war could end, at least have a chance of ending. But then who would be the head of state? That was a big, big question. Well, I pushed and I made it clear that it was going to be Moses Blah, who was the vice president of Liberia. And there was a deep resentment among the rebels about that. And the reason was that he was a Charles Taylor man. And the reason I did that, however, was that that's what the Constitution of Liberia stipulates. And so no one questioned that legally he was indeed supposed to be the next president. Now, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, had a head of state. He was not a president. His name was Judy Bryant, and he was there for some years. So you see how the line of legitimacy passes from Taylor to Blah to the interim government leader, Bryant. And then in that same Comprehensive Peace Agreement, I wrote that there would be an election in 2005. And even though there was heavy resistance in 2004 and 2005 to actually hold it on time, because the people who were in the interim government wanted to keep their jobs, for example, and others thought it was, we needed constitutional reform, scholars and others who were resident in the United States. I told them all to forget it. We're going to have an election on time as stipulated in the CPA. Why? Because I was very concerned that that line of legitimacy would be broken again. What would have happened if we'd gone beyond the stipulated election agreement date into a void, into a vacuum, power vacuum, when no one is legitimately head of Liberia? Probably back to a civil war. So we did hold the election, and you're right. The winner of the election was Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first African freely elected president in African history. And she was very recently concluded her service as the head of state, and now President Weah is now the head of state. But the important point here is not who, Jim, it's rather that no one questions that these are the legitimate people in office today. No one. And that's an extremely important point. So there's been some healing. Now, I wouldn't want to overstate it, because there's still a lot of ethnic tension in Liberia, and the way I would summarize it is to say they need to continue to work very strongly in two areas: anti-corruption, which there's still too much of that, and the second area, however, more germane to your point, is in national identity. You know, instead of if I go up to a Liberian today and ask him, you know, where are you from or who are you, he's likely to say, I'm a Kron, or I'm a Mandingo, or whatever. But I want them to one day say, I'm a Liberian. When you're abroad and somebody asks you where you're from, you don't say, I'm a Californian or I'm a New Mexican. You say what?
I'm an American.
Right. And that's national identity, and they haven't achieved that yet, and they need to work on that very much.
So you mentioned that Charles Taylor was finally removed or resigned, and he ended up at The Hague. Can you tell us how he ended up at The Hague, charged with war crimes?
He was initially went to Nigeria from Liberia when he left office as part of the understandings that were done for his removal. When he came back to Liberia in about 2006, I believe, the United Nations peacekeepers arrested him because there was a UN Security Council warrant for him. And he was sent not initially to The Hague, but to Sierra Leone for trial, because he was charged for crimes that had to do with Sierra Leone, not Liberia. He had supported the RUF, the people who had cut off all those hands and done all those other terrible things, and he was going to be tried there. But then it was deemed to be too insecure to hold him in Sierra Leone, so he was sent to The Hague for trial. That trial really lasted quite a while, and he was eventually convicted for war crimes for actions relating to what happened in Sierra Leone, not Liberia, and today he's resident in a prison in the United Kingdom.
I want to shift focus away from the Civil War in Liberia and talk about arms control. Maybe we can use the Civil War in Liberia as a touchstone. So
Sure.
you'd mentioned that the UN had placed sanctions on Liberia and on Charles Taylor's government to, basically to stop arms trade with Liberia because he was funneling weapons to the rough in Sierra Leone. What other international arms, I guess, trade or arms control mechanisms were put in place?
There were important things that did take place because of the sanctions, the introduction of state-to-state arms sales. But the real problem, the heart of the problem in Liberia, was the black market, the illicit arms trade, the part of the world gun-running trade that the arms trade agreement does not really cover.
Right.
And that was really in heavy play and still is in many countries of the world. Because there was a fellow, for example, named Victor Bout, who was a Russian, who would bring in whole containers of weapons during the war that would resupply ammunition and weapons and heavy weapons to Taylor's people. And some of these Russian arms dealers also dealt with the other side, the rebel side. So they fed newer guns and ammo into the situation all the time. So it inflamed the war and made everything much worse. That type of activity isn't really stopped by conventions of the United Nations or anywhere else. That's a major problem in instability for many parts of the world.
Okay, let's talk about arms control in general and arms races.
Yes.
Some states, when they build up their own defensive forces, make their neighboring states feel insecure and cause them to want to build up their armed forces, and you have arms races. What can, I guess, the international community do to kind of prevent arms races and to institute mechanisms that, for verification and to reduce risk?
Well, we have worked on that for decades. I think the way I think about arms control is as a pyramid. At the very apex and the most troubling and really dangerous problems of the world are what we call weapons of mass destruction. And those will include nuclear weapons and ICBMs, but nuclear weapons in general, bombs, chemical and biological weapons of mass destruction. And there's just a panoply of agreements that have had an effect of tamping down the access, the number of them, even reducing the number of them, like the START agreement, which has to do with ICBMs in Russia and the United States, in the Soviet Union, United States. And we also did what I was closely involved in, creating communication centers, the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center agreements between the Soviet Union and the United States, which was cloned for many places around the world, to make sure that people don't misunderstand when your troops or when your missile is launched, that they think they're under attack when in fact it's a drill. So we have those types of conventions. We've got the MBFR, the Mutual Balance of Forces Reductions Conventions. You have all sorts of understandings and agreements that actually do help arms control. But I'll throw one at you, which is the problem in this entire pyramid is what I would call the product life cycle. And it's a cycle that looks sort of like that. And what I'm trying to say is that no matter how complex it is, even an atomic bomb and an ICBM, through time, it becomes cheaper and easier to create by states and by non-state actors, even terrorists. And so, for example, you have to be thinking about terrorists creating their own nuclear weapons someday. You have to be thinking about states like North Korea, rogue states having an atomic weapon. In many years ago, that would have been unthinkable. But despite all the proliferation agreements,
Right.
these things are coming loose because the technology is getting older and easier to do, particularly as scientists are bought and trade the information for themselves. So that whole pyramid, if you go down even to conventional arms in the ATA, so even when you consider the bandwidth of the ATA, you've got to remember that in the real world, what are you going to do about 3D printers?
Right.
This is not a state-to-state transaction or trade matter. This is somebody in their basement making a handgun that's untraceable, or in the future, AK-47s that work as well and ammunition that works as well as the real one, and other things too. So that technology along the whole pyramid, from nuclear weapons to conventional weapons to nuclear weapons to intermediate weapons to conventional weapons, all is endangered by the product life cycle undermining those formal international conventions.
Right. So are there any lessons, though, from the past that you think are useful for some of the new nuclear power states, like India and Pakistan, potentially Iran or North Korea? Does the history of the Cold War, does any of those mechanisms, any of those approaches, or things that even you architect during the Reagan administration, are they applicable today, or are they really outdated?
Oh, they're absolutely applicable. I mean, in fact, they're even more urgent. Since you mentioned the Reagan, I'll give you an example. The Nuclear Risk Reduction Center Agreement. Look, the burn time for ICBMs and rockets between India and Pakistan is very, very short.
Right.
So you've got to have things like those centers as communications to make sure that there's no fatal misunderstanding that one side or the other thinks they're under nuclear attack.
Right.
You should also have that quick communication, and they do have a lot of it, by the way. And I like to think we pioneered it in some sense for them to copy or to use in a modified way, so that you don't have the movement of forces in an exercise, for example, be taken as an attack.
Right.
So there are absolutely lessons. There's also the lessons of START, for example, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which meant that they agreed to reduce the number of ICBMs on both sides. That also has utility and might save mankind in the long run. One of the things that has made the calculus of nuclear weapons in particular more difficult to make is the termination by the walking away by the United States of the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Used to be that it was very straightforward, that if you attacked, there would be enough missiles left to attack, so there would be mutually assured destruction, and so no one would attack. But now, as ABSM systems come about, we want to make sure that Russia, for example, understands, and I think they do, that that's still the case, that this thin ABM system, comparative to the number of ICBMs that they have, will never affect their ability to strike the United States, and has other utilities, which is, of course, a non-state actor might get a hold of one missile, or a rogue country, or a country like North Korea might launch it and you might have a chance of bringing it down with an ABM. So, but it does mean that the calculus, the cost to attack calculus, for each side is made more complicated, because there's not just offense now, there's also defense.
Right.
But lessons learned from the old days, certainly communication, certainly reducing the number of ICBMs and not just stabilizing the number of ICBMs, certainly the importance of verification in all deals. You hear a great deal of controversy, for example, in modern day, about the verification of the Iran nuclear arms treaty. There's a lot of controversy around that, but I used to and still do believe that verification is one of the most important elements of arms control agreements, and there has to be a strong verification regime in order for one side not to delude the other side and ensure there's no catastrophe. So verification is another lesson. I think also proliferation. The danger of proliferation is another lesson from the past. We've seen the number of countries who have nuclear weapons is steadily increasing. We should be working, and the UN is working with agencies like the IAEA and their ability to monitor and control arms control agreements worldwide, working very hard. But those regimes for everything from nuclear to conventional arms need to be tightened, and we also need to worry about these new technology and the effect of technology on weakening the arms control agreements that we have. And all these lessons learned can be studied and remembered by new countries who are trying to create such regimes.
Right. What about China? Do you see China as a new, I guess, antagonist in an arms race?
I think China's nuclear forces are, of course, far below those of the United States and Russia. I think that that China is not really about creating nuclear instability, although their relationship with North Korea has to be studied very closely. And they want to be a nuclear power. They are a nuclear power, but I don't see them yet trying to break out into being a major nuclear power on the same level as Russia and the United States. Where I think they are tinkering with, unfortunately, is influencing states such as North Korea who have a few nuclear weapons, and that can be extremely dangerous game. So they need to be careful about how they're dealing with North Korea.
Okay. And so new challenges you mentioned were possibly terrorist organizations or non-state actors acquiring biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons.
Correct. And they already have, because don't forget there was a sarin gas attack in the subway, I believe in London. That's a chemical weapon. And that was and so it's not really just someday, it's already happened.
So that's new area that our policies and our history really hasn't dealt with in the past. What do you recommend? What are the best approaches to deal with these non-state actors that try to proliferate?
It's very difficult because, as I said, the technology is becoming cheaper and more accessible, and it's quantumly easier to produce a chemical weapon or a biological weapon even than it is a nuclear weapon. So it's extremely difficult. I think that the United States in particular has been reluctant to have greater internal arms control and ingredients control that might make such weapons. So it would take really a revolution in thinking, particularly by the United States, about the dangers of proliferation of weapons to humanity in order to move forward and tighten the arms control regime. Theoretically, it could be done because you're in a computerized world now, and you could track just about anything anywhere and make it much harder to compose, say, chemical weapons in your basement or let alone nuclear material. And they do track nuclear material and quite well now. But you could do a vast tracking of material and try to get down to what terrorists are really using in bombs and things like that. But I don't see that in the cards at this point, because we have a history of the right to bear arms and access to commodities that can have dual use and so forth. And I don't see the United States leading the way towards a regime that could encompass control of all those other areas.
Okay. You had mentioned some lessons learned from the past. What about approaches you took in terms of getting the Russians and the United States to come to the table and reduce weapons? Or what were the approaches you had to take with some of these adversaries to get them to reach these agreements?
Well, the beginning of the history of the nuclear arms control talks really mostly belongs to a lot of people there, but I would say that in my experience, when we started in the Reagan administration, talking to the Soviet Union, it was a very strange and different world. I walked into a highly decorated, chandeliered palace in Geneva and met with a KGB agent, and we designed the tables to where the parties would talk and where the Soviet generals would sit and where we would sit and who would talk first and so on and so forth. And I remember at one point we finally designed the shape of the table for the talks, and Khrushchev was his name. He was the son of the head of the KGB. Turned to me, and I turned to him and I said, well, let's go out and tell the two sides so they can come in and begin the negotiations. And he turned to me and he said, well, we can't do that. I said, why? He said, well, if we don't take the full 4 hours, they'll think we're not serious. So we sat around and talked about each other's families and so forth for about 3 hours. But it was very tense. It was both sides were very worried. There was an excellent chance, actually, that at some point there would be an exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. People don't remember how dangerous a time it was. And but when you actually got to talk to them, you found out that beneath the extreme differences in culture, there were thinking individuals. And you could come to some sort of understandings to contain the number of things, to provide notice, to rationalize the situation so that no one would start World War III. It's much harder in a sense now because you have more entities that have these weapons, and unlike the Russians and the Soviets, not all of them are play with a full deck seemingly, and so you have situations where you're not sure what's going to happen, and so it becomes it's getting more dangerous now.
Right. Okay. So let's go to some lessons learned. If you have any other, points that you think are important takeaways from the Civil
Sure.
War, from Ebola, from
Yeah.
arms control,
From Liberia.
from Liberia.
There are a lot of lessons that can be taken away from Liberia, from studying civil conflicts in general. I've studied many of them. I've helped other countries with think some of them through. What I would say is this: all strategies by definition are unique. There is no one blueprint that will work in all cases. You can do the same things that I did in Liberia elsewhere, and they might not work. So there's no one recipe, and for a million reasons: history, ethnic issues, economic differences, political differences. No one formula will do it. And that's why I call it the art and not the science uh, of, of searching for answers to complex situations. You have to be able to create your own strategy. But what you can do and learn from the past is what you ought to be looking at, and what, if you're doing a painting, what paint pots there are to go to paint your own strategy. And you also must remember that all strategies have to be modified. No strategy goes soup to nuts without being changed. I've never seen a successful strategy that does that. One of the most important lessons, I think, is that successful strategies are not linear strategies. In other words, when you approach a complex situation like the Liberian Civil War, you don't just worry about what you have to do today. You have to be thinking about what you're likely to face in 30 days simultaneously, in 60 days simultaneously. What are the problems that I will face 90 days from now simultaneously, 6 months, a year out? You have to make some assumptions, but you have to begin to mobilize forces and feedback to alter your strategy to face all those things simultaneously. It's kind of like multitasking, as opposed to, well, if they do this, then we'll consider doing that, and maybe then we'll work on this. That never works. So that's an important axiom of successful composition of strategies for each individual complex situation. Another one is, if you have a complex situation that you face, like Liberia, but it could be anywhere, try to make a complex situation less complex. So, for example, we had a blockage, and it really was a total blockage to the peace process in Liberia, named Charles Taylor.
Right.
And so we worked very hard, many of us, to find a way for him to get out of the equation. And we did. What are we really doing there? We are simplifying the situation. When I went through no man's land with others to negotiate with the rebel commanders and inserted an interpositional force between the combatant parties, and had them pull back, the rebels pull back physically miles. What was I doing? I was simplifying the situation. Much later on, we had tens of thousands of child soldiers from all sides, government, rebels, people who hadn't even fought, running around with loaded AK-47s and RPGs and everything else. So we decided that we would have a disarmament of those people. And we took those guns away from them, most of them anyway, and then we followed up by employing a lot of them. And I employed thousands of them myself to fix roads and bridges they'd blown up and so forth. What were we really doing? We were simplifying, taking the guns away, and the next lesson might be improving our monopoly of force. Monopoly of force is really, really important, and so is DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And you can't just have a takedown and then a golden hour and then stop.
Right.
I mean, this was the error we committed, really, in essence, in Iraq.
Right.
And we did it again, not just we, but others, NATO, really, in Libya. Libya was a disaster. There really wasn't a good strategy there, and it turned into a disaster, and is still a disaster.
Right.
But in Liberia, we had a comprehensive approach to what are we going to do with all these people? Well, we're going to give them hope. We're going to give them a job. We're going to tell them what's coming next. We're going to send them back to school. We're going to do all these things. And also, that I will now mention that brings up another lesson learned, which is momentum. Momentum. It's like a tennis match, Jim. You know, if you play tennis and you just wait to see what happens when you're volleying back and forth, what's going to happen to you? You're going to lose, right? So you want to volley, you want to set the agenda. You want to tell them what's coming next. You also want buy-in from the local populace, but initially in particular, you want to have a very clear outline that this society is through with war, we're moving on, and by the way, here's the next bunch of things that we're going to do. We're going to open that port, we're going to start that school, university, we're going to do these things. We're going to have so much going on that everybody just says, hey, I don't have time for war, I've got other interests.
Right.
And that's what we did in Liberia.
Right.
Well, there's many other lessons to take away from Liberia and other problems. I mentioned internationalizing the problem. Don't try to do everything yourself. I mean, we had, I don't know, 15, 20 countries working on Liberia. NGOs, very, very important. Non-governmental organizations of all sorts. We had kind of, I would say, a web of peace built, composed of all hands on deck. Everybody can. Liberians groups, which
Right.
we helped to get going again after they were devastated after the war. So it's a web of peace. And another lesson, fight corruption.
Mhm.
We actually, I instigated and the World Bank helped us develop what's called the Government Economic Management Assistance Program for Liberia. Because corruption was so endemic, so extreme in Liberia, everything was being stolen. I remember I once went into a ministry and Charles Taylor was Liberian, and I talked to a senior official and I said, "When's the last time you got paid?" And he said, "2 years ago." And I said, "Why are you here?" And he just looked at me and smiled. Well, he was using his little power to extort people to get that stamp or whatever it had to be. And so the whole country was a patrimonial, disorganized, corrupt mess. And so we had a program in Liberia that we implemented after the war called GMAT, this Government Economic Management Assistance Program. And I actually brought in Treasury people, former Treasury people, and put them in the Ministry of Finance, in the central bank, at the port, all over the place. And they had dual signature authority, so the money couldn't move anywhere without them signing off on it. Lo and behold, some of the money began to flow back into reconstruction, into the Liberian people to recover. So the Liberian people's respect for what was going on rose.
Right.
Think how different, Jim, this is than Afghanistan,
Right.
where we put up with Karzai for how many years?
Right. Right. So all those
Total venality.
right, all those reconstruction activities, the momentum you had, really what you did in the post-conflict space really had the impact in recovery. Not necessarily just stopping the belligerents from fighting, but with all those activities that led to the road to recovery is what really kept the peace.
Right. And it wasn't just the United States, I want to
Mhm.
emphasize. I mean, we made a point of having, we had the United Nations peacekeepers again, who did a splendid job. They had economic programs as well as security programs, and brought a certain law and order to the situation. They had a quick reaction force to put down firefights that did occur.
Right.
We had reform of various sectors of the economy. We had also other countries work in health infrastructure and other projects. Nordic countries, the British did a great job. The Japanese, the Chinese were there. I mean, it was all hands on deck. And we had programs. We didn't do it perfectly. We made a lot of mistakes.
Right.
But we kept the momentum going. We kept forward. We kept hope alive that there would be a new Liberia, a new day. And in fact, there was.
So how did you communicate with the population and give them this hope and this idea that there would be a better future?
Well, as you might be able to tell by now, I have no problem getting in front of a camera. And so one of the ways I would do this, besides, would be I would actually, there wasn't much TV in Liberia, especially after the war, but Radio Veritas and the Catholic Church radio and others was on all the time. And I would actually get on and hold press conferences and sort of tell folks, what road we're on and where we're going. And then, of course, work with the interim government to increase capacity. I mean, the interim government itself had tremendous corruption problems. It was, in essence, the price we had to pay at the peace table. We kind of assigned the warring parties various ministries, which they then tried to loot out. But we knew that that would all end when we had the scheduled election in 2005, which I insisted take place on time, and was very difficult to have that done, that we would start to get a more honest regime. And I also brought in the GMAT program. So we had all these other things which were to try to get that energy going, jobs, 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 and a cleaner government than was before.
Did any of the interim government officials, continue the communications processes that you had started? Were they also holding press conferences and going on the radio?
The interim government was pretty corrupt. It was the price of peace, what we had to do. So they, with some exceptions, didn't do that brilliant a recovery job. So it was actually the external actors, the United Nations, the various countries, donor programs, the NGOs, the Liberian NGOs that did more of the
Okay.
recovery work than the ministries themselves
Okay.
during the interim government. Now, during the regime of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the government became more alive, although there still are corruption problems in Liberia.
Right. So what's the impact of corruption? How does it reduce legitimacy in the communities? How does it, prevent the government from providing essential services? What's the
It is underestimated
Mhm.
as a cause of terrorism.
Mhm.
People don't understand that corruption is the incubator of terrorism.
Mhm.
If you're if you're a simple villager, I don't care if you're Afghanistan or Iraq or in some African country,
Right.
and you can't get anything because all your resources are stolen, you're taxed to death, your police force is really preys upon you.
Mhm.
I mean, look at what happened in the Arab Spring. The one commonality among all those different societies was that they went and attacked the police.
Mhm.
That tells you something very dramatic, which is you must have honest governance, rule of law. And by the way, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I'm afraid this is a criticism that's partially directed at the United States, we let that slide a bit. We let all this corruption go on. But in fact, look, that's what the people resent.
Mhm.
They want services for their taxes. They want services. They want to see progress on those roads. They don't want to be beat up by the police and robbed by the police. And so you've got to have cleaner governance. It doesn't have to be a mirror image of the United States, but it's got to be something where they don't feel like now they have to join a rebel movement.
Right.
You have to worry about employment. Let me give you an example. When we intervened in Afghanistan for good cause, I thought it was going to be a raid. I didn't know we were going to stay forever in Afghanistan. I just thought we should go in and punish the bad guys and then tell the Taliban government if they ever did it to them, we'd put them back in the Stone Age. But we decided we would stay, and there was a great deal of mission creep in Afghanistan,
Right.
and we tried to turn it into, I don't know, Indiana or something. And what happened though is that the corruption was not dealt with in the way we did in Liberia, and so you had for example, unemployment in Afghanistan when we entered the Afghanistan area was about at the 20+% mark for unemployed youth. That was in 2002. Do you know what it is today? At the 25th percent mark for unemployed youth.
Right.
So we've made absolutely no economic progress in sopping up the pool of potential terrorists. You can still go in and hire a terrorist cheap in Afghanistan after how many billions of dollars of reconstruction? This is very poor strategy.
Right. About complexity. So
Yeah.
now you discussed about how you kind of reduced the complexity of the conflict, but then you mentioned a lot of international organizations, non-government organizations, different, U.S. agencies that you brought in there. How did you control the complexity of of all those international actors that were helping out?
And the sequencing.
Right.
You didn't.
Okay.
I mean, to be very honest,
Right.
I mean, there was a World Bank sort of matrix,
Okay.
like a spreadsheet
Right.
of who was doing what, and that did help.
Right.
But, I would just be telling you a white lie, I guess, if I tried to imply that we had the whole thing woven together like some fantastic carpet.
Right.
I mean, there were lots of loose ends and there were lots of disconnects.
Right.
But what there also was there was a lot of material. I
Right.
mean, we kept throwing up programs here and programs there. And did they exactly create that beautiful carpet we were looking for in Reconstruction? No. But was it a carpet? Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah, it had holes in it, but it was a carpet.
Right. Okay. What other insights do you think you have about the art?
Of strategy creation?
Yes.
One is very simple, which is show me the money. Show me the money. If you don't have the money to implement your strategy, you don't have a strategy.
Right.
And I had that problem very dramatically. I came back to Washington after having succeeded really in ending the war part of it, and I was flabbergasted to find out that both the State Department and the Department of Defense was not going to support me in having any post-war money.
Right.
Our budget was not going to be robust enough to even begin to cover the things that had to be done in Liberia to prevent a war from reoccurring, going back to war, because all these tens of thousands of armed young men, child soldiers, had nothing to do, no way to eat.
Right.
So, you know, if you have a stick in a hole and someone hands you an AK-47, what is it? It's an upgrade. So I told them that, look, you simply have to provide me with the money, or all this effort that we've gone before is going to be wasted. We're going to recycle back to a civil war and maybe a failed state and so forth, and a terrorist incubator. So what I had to do under that situation was appeal directly to Congress. So I went up and I talked to Senator Warner, most importantly because he had come out and seen what was going on in Liberia. I owe him a great gratitude, and I think so does the United States, for his heroic act of supporting our programs in Liberia. And also I talked to Hillary Clinton and John McCain, and they more or less told the administration that unless we had funding for the reconstruction in Liberia, they weren't going to do the Iraq supplemental. So all of a sudden, there was support within the executive branch for what I was doing.
But so you got a lot of international funding and resources as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Like I said, Colin Powell graciously hosted a donor meeting in New York in 2004. I think it was February 2004, on Liberia, and we created a lot of money from outside the United States there. There were also generous donations from others, from the European countries, from Asia even. There were also donations in kind and activities in kind even from China. It was not just a U.S. endeavor. If we had tried to do the whole thing, Jim, we would have failed. Internationalizing the problem was one of the great keys to our success.
Ambassador Blaney, thank you very much for being here with us and explaining and sharing your insights and experiences with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure and an honor.